Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 4 of Import Nights, the review series for GranTurismo's selection of, as the name implies, Japanese imports, specifically performance imports. And in this particular pick we're featuring one of my preferred vehicles in this class, one of my go-to vehicles, one of a few different versions of the Honda Integra, which we have featured on GT6. There are quite a few different variations within the categories of Integra, but in terms of actual Integra models, there are two main ones on the game, the DC2 and the DC5, and then there are multiple variations of each of those. Now in the case of this particular review, we are reviewing the DC5, as you can see, and it's the premium DC5. Now personally, this is not my favourite of the Integra Type Rs that are featured on the game of the DC5 shape. I actually prefer the non-premium version. I think it's a better looking car, especially from the front. This version though is the premium. It's the more obvious choice, the potentially better value deal, considering that it is a premium, it looks better, it's got the detailed interior, the body modifications, etc. So the question is, what do you get and how does it compare to the other cars in this series? Because this is a relatively eclectic series. You've got quite a few different kinds of vehicle going up head to head. Usually in most of my series the vehicles tend to fall within similar parameters. A couple of the series though go a bit more out on a limb. The vehicles can vary quite a lot more, such as Days Gone By with the classics. You can have some which are relatively modest in terms of performance, and then you can have others which are more extreme. Now this particular car is not necessarily extremely fast, but it's certainly a quick model. It's powered of course by a VTEC engine, it's front wheel drive, and the power is pretty decent. It's powered by a 2 litre turbo engine, so it's a larger capacity than the DC2, and it puts out 455 horsepower fully tuned. Not necessarily as much as it deserves to have, but at the same time is still a decent amount. As far as torque, well, it's a Honda, so unsurprisingly the torque isn't particularly high because they don't really go for that. It puts out 273 foot-pounds, and even the torque that it does have is kicked out at quite a high RPM, 8,500 RPM for peak torque, 9,000 RPM for peak power. So like all VTECs, this really is an engine that likes to be worked hard, and to get the best out of it, similar to say a motorbike or various other vehicles like that, which tend to be high revving, small, lightweight, this is a car which needs to be basically on the limit at all times. You need to push it as hard as it can go to get the best out of the engine. Now compound that with the fact that this car is quite reasonable in terms of size. It's not an overly big car, but not particularly small either, and it is quite light. It only weighs 988 kilos, which is very respectable for a decent sized sport coupe, and partially that is thanks to the front wheel drive. That helps to keep the weight down. Now as far as horsepower per tonne, it's pretty good because of how low that weight is. 461 horsepower is not bad at all, especially given that it has nowhere near the kind of power to work with as say an RX-7, a Skyline, a Supra, that kind of thing. As far as its PP, it does still sit relatively high for its overall spec at 538. And to be honest, I wouldn't really recommend racing it at that level, because although it's certainly not a bad car, it just doesn't have, especially the low-end performance out of corners, to keep up with say an all-wheel drive or a rear-wheel drive car, not because of the front-wheel drive, but because it just doesn't have enough power to keep up with them, and the power that it does have, if you push it too hard out of low-speed corners, will just result in wheel spin. So although it's a great performance car, it needs to be kept with a high average speed to work best. You need to get that flow from corner to corner correct, and if you can keep that flow up, the car will give you great lap times. That being said, it's still only got 455 horsepower to work with, so at that kind of PP level, there are just significantly faster vehicles that you can get. It is a very good handling car for sure, but the amount of tracks which will actually allow you to have a complete advantage in that regard are relatively few. Now, as far as performance, It's certainly not slow. The top speed's well over 200, the acceleration, obviously off the line, it's not as quick as a rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive car, but it's not bad for a front-wheel drive car because the weight is low, and the torque steer and wheel spin are pretty good for a front-wheel drive car. It's one of the better models in terms of conserving its tyres. Overall, if you're considering buying one, and what kind of circumstance it would be good to use in, I would say that this car in particular, the DC5 rather than the DC2, but to some degree they're similar in this way, is more the kind of car that I would say is good to use when your power options are limited, rather than PP, because in most lobbies people do things by PP, it's the simplest way to do it. But if you are, for instance, in a situation where you can only have, say, 450 horsepower or 400 or even less, then this is the kind of car that's definitely worth considering, because for its power, it is very quick. It's just when you compare it to cars with 200, 300, 400 horsepower more that it can appear slow. But of course it's going to appear slow, it has so much less power. If you compare this car with this tune to, say, a Skyline with that much power, this car's actually surprisingly competitive against it. It's just not allowed to reach the kind of power limits, as I said at the start of the video, that it arguably deserves. So if you use it in situations where you can use the lack of power to your advantage against your opponents, such as when they're not allowed to use their full power, then it's a great car to go for. And it's also very fun to drive, and that's a good thing to always bear in mind when you're looking just to buy a car for fun. For racing though, the most important thing I would say is to know this car's limitations. It's a great car, but keep it within its area of expertise, and you'll do alright. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.